They say the forest spirits punish the proud, but no one believed it. Until Mara. It was just past midnight when she came stumbling out of the mist, barefoot, her dress torn and clinging to her like wet parchment. Her long, dark hair hung in tangled ropes, soaked through with rain and streaked with mud. Blood traced a thin line down the side of her temple. Her eyes, those bright, defiant eyes that always held a spark of mischief, were wide now, empty of their usual fire, full, instead of a terror that chilled the air more than the wind ever could. She stood in the middle of the village road trembling. The fog coiled around her ankles like smoke, and for a long, frozen moment, no one dared to move. Doors creaked open. One by one, the villagers stepped out from their homes, wrapped in blankets, clutching candles, some whispering prayers beneath their breath. Mara's lips parted. "It followed me," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper that barely rose above the sound of the trees swaying beyond the fields. I thought he was lying, but it followed me." Someone gasped. An old woman crossed herself. Children were pulled behind doorways. She took a step forward, and that's when they saw it. Her feet were torn and bleeding, as though she'd run for miles through thorns. Scratches marred her arms. Her skin was pale as moonlight. But what struck them most wasn't the blood or the bruises. It was the look in her eyes, not just fear, but devastation, like something inside her had shattered beyond repair. And then someone asked the question that no one had dared speak. "Where's Father Tomas?" Silence fell. The wind died. Mara didn't answer. She just looked toward the forest, the old woods beyond the chapel hill, and began to cry. A voice, older, worn with time, cut through the scene, not from the crowd, but from somewhere deeper, a narrator. "Let me tell you the story of how pride, pain, and a single laugh unleashed something no one could ever take back." And just like that, the night held its breath. What had she seen out there in the dark? What had followed her home? And why was the village priest nowhere to be found? The story begins here, and it doesn't end how you think. Mara was 19, and she'd always been the kind of girl who made people whisper. Not because she sought attention, but because she refused to play along. In a village clinging to the old ways, where every home had a rusted iron charm nailed above the door, and every child was warned never to stray beyond the edge of the woods, Mara stood apart. She was beautiful in a wild, untamed way, sharp eyes, sharper tongue, and a mind that never bent easily to tradition. Her intelligence ran deep, but it came laced with a kind of quiet bitterness, a knowing almost, like she'd already seen what the world had to offer, and she wanted more. The village of Valine was small, hidden in the folds of the northern mountains, where the fog moved like a living thing, and the trees whispered if you listened too long. The villagers lived close to the land and closer to their fears. Tales of the forest shadows were passed down like heirlooms. They spoke of spirits older than the chapel itself, of voices in the trees and footsteps that followed even when you ran. But Mara didn't believe in any of it. She'd grown up in the shadow of the chapel, raised by her mother, Lena, a seamstress with soft hands and a softer voice. Her father had vanished when she was 3. Taken by the forest, they used to say. But Mara had stopped believing that before she could read. She figured he'd just left, like she planned to. Because Mara's dream wasn't to marry a merchant's son or work the loom. It was to leave, to disappear into the city, to study something that mattered, to make a name that didn't echo through foggy valleys and wooden chapel pews. She wanted the roar of carriages, the smell of ink and stone, not mud and myth. But dreams don't always match reality. Her mother had fallen ill 3 winters ago. It started small, fatigue, coughing, but by spring, she couldn't stand for more than an hour without collapsing. The doctors from the valley said it was something of the nerves. but the village women called it a soft curse, a punishment for the past. Some whispered that Mara's father had angered the spirits, and Lena bore the price. To Mara, it was just nonsense, but superstition was harder to fight than illness, especially when it came in the form of Father Thomas, the village priest, a quiet man, thin and pale, always dressed in black. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it seemed like he knew something no one else did. He warned the village often of the old forest ways, of offerings forgotten, of laughter that echoed too loud beneath the trees. Mara made him the butt of her jokes, called him the ghost in robes, laughed when he warned children not to walk near the altar stones. She didn't know then how close that laughter would come to a scream. She didn't know that the very thing she mocked would one day follow her home and never leave. The hardest part wasn't the cold or the hunger or the way the mountain mist crept into your bones. The hardest part was the smallness. Mara felt it every day, the suffocating sense that her life was already written for her in some crumbling book of village law. A future of patching dresses, saying prayers, marrying a man who smelled like sheep and ale, and dying in the same bed where she was born. All because somewhere out there, in the woods she didn't fear, there were stories, spirits, shadows. Fear was the strongest currency in Velen, and Amara was broke. She spent her mornings fetching water from the spring, her afternoons tending to her mother, and her nights staring out her window, watching the fog gather like ghosts on the hills. She read science books when she could borrow them, scribbled letters to no one, dreaming of cities she'd only seen on weathered postcards. She wanted knowledge, reason, escape, and she hated how much of her life bowed to things no one could prove. So when the harvest festival came, a rare break from the routine of toil and quiet dread, she welcomed it like a storm. The whole village gathered in the chapel square, dressed in their best. Lanterns swung from the trees. Bread was shared. Mead flowed. And as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Father Thomas took his place beneath the chapel bell. He raised his hands. His voice, always gentle, carried over the crowd. "This is the time of year," he said, "when the veil between worlds thins. The forest remembers, and it takes those who mock its silence." A hush fell. Eyes widened. Children clutched their mothers' skirts. But Mara laughed, loud, unfiltered, bold. The sound cracked through the stillness like thunder. "So what, Father? The trees get jealous if we don't whisper thank you into the bark." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some turned away. Others simply stared at her as if she'd grown horns. Father Tomas said nothing. He didn't scold her. He didn't move. He just looked at her with a long, slow sadness, like he was watching a candle flicker out in a locked room. That night, the air grew cold earlier than usual. Mara woke to silence. She went to check on her mother and found her still, eyes closed, breathing shallow, skin cool but not cold, alive but unreachable. No pain, no cries, no warnings, just gone, inside herself, as if something had taken her soul and left the body behind. The doctor came from the next village. He searched, tapped, checked, measured. "There's no cause I can find," he muttered, frowning. "She's not sick. She's just not here." By morning, the whispers began. They say she mocked the old ways. She laughed at Father Thomas. She invited something in, and suddenly, the village that Mara never believed in began to believe something about her. Something dark, something dangerous. For a time, it felt like the universe had cracked open just enough to let in a little light. His name was Ivo, a young herbalist from the lowlands, sent to deliver rare roots and tinctures to the mountain villagers. He was not like the others. No talismans hung around his neck, no fear in his eyes. He walked with the ease of someone who had touched books not bones. And when Mara met him, standing at her door with wind-tangled hair and a satchel of clinking vials, she felt something she hadn't in weeks: hope. He knelt beside her mother, checked her pulse, examined her eyes. He muttered theories: catatonic states, neurological shock, even rare herbs that could mimic death. It was all strange and foreign to the villagers, but to Mara, it was the first time someone spoke her language. "You think it's a sickness," she said, watching him work. "I think it's not a curse," he replied with a half-smile, "which, around here, seems to be a radical opinion." They laughed, and Mara realized it had been days since she'd even smiled. They spent hours together. Ivo taught her how to distill certain roots for calming oils. Mara showed him the hidden corners of the village, the old maps carved into chapel stone, the forest boundaries etched in lore. They formed a strange alliance: science and rebellion, two minds refusing to kneel before shadow. But not everything stayed light. Ivo began waking in the middle of the night, covered in sweat. "I keep seeing trees," he told her one morning, his face pale, "and a man crying, alone, drenched in rain. I think it's the priest." Mara tried to laugh it off, but the sound came forced, because part of her remembered Father Thomas's face at the festival, that look, that unbearable sorrow. And then, one gray morning, he came to her door. Father Thomas. His cloak was soaked, his eyes more sunken than ever. He didn't ask permission, he begged. "You must go to the altar," he said, voice breaking, "in the forest. You must kneel. Offer apology. Not for your sake, Mara, for your mother's. You've awakened something that doesn't forgive mockery." His hands trembled as he held them out to her. Not with anger, with grief. She slammed the door in his face. "Get out," she said through gritted teeth. "Take your ghosts with you." But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was watching. And that night, when Mara lit the lantern by her mother's bed, she thought she saw something flicker in the corner of the room. A shape that didn't belong. She told herself it was nothing. But doubt had already begun to grow. It started with the trees. 3 narrow symbols, like claw marks arranged in a spiral, appeared one morning on the trunks outside Mara's house. They hadn't been there the day before. She was sure of it. They were fresh, still bleeding sap. No tool she knew could carve so deep without splintering the bark. They seemed burned into the wood, or branded. Mara stared at them for a long time, something cold settling in her stomach. She told herself they were just tricks, kids playing games, but the pattern gnawed at her. It felt intentional, familiar, watched. Ivo went into the woods that afternoon. He was determined to trace the markings, see if they formed a path, if they led to something rational, some hidden grove, a strange mold, perhaps a prankster with too much time and too little sense. He never came back. That night, Mara waited by the window until the lantern burned out. By morning, the villagers were whispering again. Not about curses, about Ivo, about disappearances. The last person to vanish in the woods had been a child, 10 winters ago. They'd never found her bones, but something worse was happening at home. Mara had woken in the middle of the night to a soft thump on the floorboards. Thinking it was the wind, she turned over, until she heard it again. A dragging sound, a slow, heavy crawl. She crept into the hall, heart pounding, and saw the faint outline of her mother, not standing, crawling, bent backwards at the waist, her hands stiff and crooked, her head lolling as though it were too heavy to lift. Mara didn't scream. She couldn't. She stood frozen until her mother collapsed just outside her own bedroom door, unmoving once more, unconscious by dawn, as if nothing had happened. Later that day, A neighbor whispered through the fence. "I saw her," the old woman said, clutching her rosary, "crawling across your window like a beast." Something inside Mara broke. She hadn't cried in weeks, but now the tears came like a flood. She didn't care about pride or proof or the sneering voice inside her that said, "You're too smart for this." She just wanted her mother back. So she did what she had sworn never to do. She packed a lantern, tied her boots, wrapped a red scarf around her neck the way her mother used to when the wind turned bitter, and she walked into the forest, past the line of charms, past the rusted boundary stones, and into the path Father Thomas had warned her about, where even the birds didn't sing, and the trees leaned too close as if listening. She followed the symbols, spirals burned into bark, leading her deeper until the world became nothing but fog and whispering leaves. Then she saw it, a stone altar, blackened with age, cracked with moss, and kneeling before it, Father Tomas. He was weeping. When he turned, his face was streaked with mud and tears, his voice barely more than a breath. "It's already chosen you," he said, and the woods around them fell silent. The air changed the moment Father Thomas spoke those words. "It's already chosen you." At first, it was subtle, a hush, like the world holding its breath. But then the forest moved. Trees that had stood for centuries began to creak, not from wind, but as if they were shifting, awakening. Leaves twisted without breeze, curling inward like they were recoiling from something unseen. A low groan echoed through the branches, too deep to be wind, too hollow to be human. Mara stumbled back, clutching the lantern tight. Its flame flickered violently, casting shadows that bent the wrong way. And then the whispers began. They came from every direction, high and low, some like children giggling, others like old women murmuring secrets through broken teeth. Her name, over and over. "Mara, Mocker, yours now." She turned, and the forest blurred. Shapes flickered in the fog, figures stepping between the trees, never fully seen. One appeared before her for a moment, just long enough to send her reeling backward. A child, barefoot, hollow-eyed, her mouth split into a smile too wide for her face. Another step back, another figure, a man with no eyes, dripping with mud, mumbling prayers in a voice that sounded just like Evo's. Then her mother, standing in the mist, head tilted, eyes wide and empty. "Mama," Mara whispered, stepping forward. But when she touched the figure's hand, it turned to ash. She screamed. Father Tomas grabbed her arm. "Look at me. Look at me." She gasped for breath, clutching at reality like it might slip from her hands. "The spirit doesn't kill," he said softly. "It claims. It takes the proud, the ones who mock what they don't understand, and it makes them walk here, between, never truly dead, never truly living." She shook her head. "No, I didn't mean to. It doesn't care." He looked up at the blackened altar, and Mara saw something shift in his eyes. A resignation. A quiet, aching love. For her, or maybe for the village, the people he had protected for so long. "There's only one way," he said. "No banishment. Only bargain." "What are you talking about?" "I offer myself," he whispered. "Let it take me. Let her live." "No, Father, no!" Mara grabbed at him, her voice cracking. "You don't have to do this. There has to be another way." But the forest answered for him. The ground beneath the altar split open, not violently, but like a mouth yawning wide, slow and terrible. A black void, crawling with roots and silence. Father Thomas pressed a charm into her palm. "Keep this near your heart, and remember, faith is not always blind. Sometimes it's brave." He stepped toward the altar. She tried to stop him, but the earth took him. One moment he stood before her. The next, he was gone, swallowed. The forest went still. The voices stopped. Even the fog seemed to hold itself. Mara dropped to her knees, breath ragged, the charm shaking in her hand. She had never believed, never prayed, never once bowed her head to anything she couldn't explain. And yet, something inside her broke. Or maybe it opened. She stayed there, alone, until the sun began to bleed through the mist. Then she stood and began walking home. She thought the worst was over, but as she reached the edge of the forest, she heard something behind her, a footstep, then another. She turned and saw nothing, but she felt it. She wasn't alone, not anymore. The village didn't greet her with open arms when she returned. No one asked where Father Thomas had gone. No one spoke his name. They just looked away when she passed, some with pity, some with quiet fear. But Mara didn't care, because when she stepped back into her house, her mother was awake, sitting up, breathing, alive. Mara dropped to her knees and sobbed into her mother's lap, whispering thank yous to no one, to everyone, to the broken pieces of a man who had given his life in her place. But something was off. Her mother's eyes were open, but they didn't see. They stared too long, blinked too slowly. When she spoke, her voice was softer, distant, like hearing someone talk through glass. And at night, Mara would hear her move, quietly, with purpose, pacing, watching. Ivo's things were returned to her by the herbalist's guild, his small satchel, his notes, his journal. Mara couldn't bring herself to read it at first, but when the footsteps began, again, when the whispering returned, just behind doors and mirrors, she opened the pages in desperation. They were filled with drawings, symbols, trees, the altar, but one sketch stood out. A girl, her limbs tangled like vines, hair made of withered leaves, eyes weeping dark streaks like ink. Beneath it, Ivo had written, "She walks with the ones who mock. She remembers laughter. She hates it." Mara dropped the book. The candle beside her flickered, though there was no wind. That night, she sat alone by her window, clutching the charm Tomas had given her. The air was heavy again. The trees outside stood too still, and she knew it wasn't over. The bargain hadn't ended anything. It had only delayed it. The spirit wanted more than flesh. It wanted remorse, humility, a heart cracked open, not just frightened, but changed. Mara stood, wrapped herself in her red scarf, and stepped out once more into the mist. Her body trembled, but her steps were steady. This time she wouldn't mock. She wouldn't run. She would go back to the altar, not to fight, but to surrender. The rain started as a whisper. By the time Mara reached the forest's edge, it was a storm. Sheets of water slashed through the trees. Thunder cracked like ancient bones splitting beneath the earth. Still, she did not turn back. With every step, the mud clung tighter to her boots, as if the forest itself wished to keep her out or draw her in. The path to the altar was barely visible now, choked by creeping roots and swaying, groaning branches. But Mara remembered. Her feet moved on memory alone. She reached the clearing just as lightning carved a jagged scar across the sky. The altar stood waiting, worn by time, drenched in sorrow, and she dropped to her knees before it, not in fear, but in guilt. Her breath came in sobs, not from terror, but from the crushing weight of understanding. "I laughed," she whispered through the downpour, "not because I knew better, but because I was afraid to believe. I called it nonsense, fairy tales. I thought strength was mocking what others feared, but I was a coward." Thunder roared. She bowed lower. "My mother nearly died because of my pride. Ivo is gone. Tomas Tomas gave everything for me, and I gave nothing. Her voice cracked as she reached into her pocket and pulled out the iron charm, the last thing Father Tomas had touched. I mocked you, she said, so now I give you what mocked you. She pressed the charm against her heart, my voice, my name, my laughter, the part of me that thought it was better than you. The wind howled, and then silence, so complete, so hollow, it hurt her ears. When she looked up, she wasn't alone. The spirit stood at the altar's edge. It was not a monster, it was a girl, no older than Mara, but she was twisted by time, by grief. Her limbs were tangled branches, her eyes hollow and shining like sap. Her hair flowed like vines in water, and she wept, silent, eternal tears. Then came the vision. It struck not her eyes, but her soul. A village, long before Mara's time. A girl, bright and clever, different, mocked, shamed, cast into the forest during a festival for making light of the old ways. Her laughter turned to screams. The forest took her, but not with cruelty. It changed her, wrapped her pain in bark and memory, until she was no longer girl. She was warning. She was vengeance. She was sorrow. And as Mara stared into her eyes, she saw herself. I see you now, Mara whispered, reaching out. The spirit flinched, unused to kindness. But Mara did not pull back. I mocked because I didn't understand. I mocked you, and now I do. She placed her hand gently on the spirit's cheek. A moment passed, and the girl made of branches closed her eyes and smiled. The rain stopped, the forest stilled, and the spirit faded, not in rage, not in defeat, but in peace. The morning came quietly. No more thunder, no more whispers in the dark. The village woke to still air and soft light pouring through the mist. Chickens stirred, doors creaked open. People stepped out, blinking at the strange, gentle peace that had settled like dew on every rooftop. In Mara's home, her mother stirred beneath her blanket, not just waking, but alive, fully, her breathing steady, her eyes bright, alert, present. When she turned to Mara, her smile was the same one that had raised her, scolded her, loved her, but streaks of white now threaded through her hair, like the forest had left its own quiet signature behind. No one spoke of it. No one needed to. Mara stepped outside and found the village waiting. They didn't ask questions. They didn't demand explanations. They just watched her, as if realizing, for the first time, that something had shifted. In her. In everything. She returned to the forest days later. There was no altar. In its place stood a single young tree, slender, vibrant, reaching skyward, and at its roots, half buried in the moss, was Ivo's pendant, still glinting with that curious defiance he always wore in his eyes. She touched it gently, smiled, and whispered, "Thank you." From that day on, Mara was not a priest, not a mystic. She wore no robes, spoke no rituals. But when children asked about the forest, when the wind moaned through the valley and old women looked nervously at the trees, they came to her. She didn't feed their fear. She didn't dismiss it either. She listened. She taught. She balanced the old and the new, offering roots to the ones who clung too tightly to branches and wings to the ones who feared the ground. They called her the keeper, and sometimes, late in the evening, when the fire crackled low and someone made a nervous joke about spirits or shadows, Mara would laugh again. But it wasn't the old laugh, sharp, proud, untouchable. Now it was warm, grounded, gentle. The kind of laugh that remembered sorrow, the kind of laugh that had once cost her everything and returned with grace. Pride is loud, but wisdom whispers. And sometimes it's the ones who laugh loudest who are heard last by the forest. Pause, a beat of silence, like a closing book. We all carry a little Mara inside us, questioning, doubting, testing the boundaries of what we think is real and what we fear might be. But the question remains, have you ever ignored a warning you should have heeded? Have you ever felt something just beyond what eyes can see, yet couldn't explain? Maybe it was a superstition your grandmother whispered, a place you refused to go, a dream you couldn't quite shake. Tell us below, would you have entered that forest or laughed like Mara? Your story might be closer to hers than you think. And if this tale stirred something in you, a chill, a question, or just the echo of your own laughter turning quiet, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.